Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Ixenthurkear for Ixenthurkear Does Art, and I'd like to thank y'all for coming back one more time. I have a new piece that I've put up today, and I think I'm going to tell you all about it as well as the story time. So let's get into this. So the piece that I did today is called Ghost Moonship, and it is done in watercolor. I have been seeing a lot of gorgeous watercolors being done online lately by like Casey Golden, I believe Diana Norland is another one. There's just so many beautiful pieces, and I kind of wanted to try doing some watercolor myself. So I haven't really done watercolor in a very long time because of a teacher in 8th grade. But that's my story time for today. So let me tell you a little more about my piece, and then I'll tell you the story. So I tried using the salt technique that I've seen some artists do, and apparently my paper wasn't wet enough for the salt to really like stick to it. It kept bouncing when I first put salt on. So I put some more water on, but some of the salt had already stuck, so it caused the salt to melt, which I'm pretty sure it's not supposed to do, but it did leave this really interesting crystallization effect on the moon area. So while it wasn't something I meant to have happen, it actually looked really cool. So, you win some, you lose some. So when I was drawing Ghost Moonship, I drew it with the artist Loft watercolor pencils, and I used the ultramarine one. And when I was painting the moon in the background, the ship that I had drawn in the first place kind of disappeared a little bit in the water, which actually is something I wanted to have happen, just not that quickly. So when I went to do the actual painting part, I had to kind of remember where the lines were, so it might look a little wonky, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm still really proud of this, since I haven't done a real watercolor piece really ever, I think, except for one time when I was messing around with that masking fluid, and that just totally tore up my paper. So that's probably going to be another story some other time in the future if I ever figure out how to make masking fluid work. So now let's get into the story time. Alright, so my art teacher had many hats that he wore at school. He was the art teacher for 8th grade through 12th grade. He was a history teacher. I think he also had a math class that he taught. He was also the football coach. So that wasn't really unusual in my school where I went to school at. He did actually have, I think, more different class types than any of the other teachers did. But still, he was primarily, I guess, the art teacher. I do remember hearing him say once that if he could choose to only teach one class type, it would be the art classes. But at the same time, when I was in art classes with him, it didn't really seem that way. I remember when I took art class in high school, he'd write the assignment on the board, and then he'd go into his room and he would play solitaire the entire time that we should have been, well, making things like stained glass and working with knives and heat, and he left high schoolers alone with knives and heat and glass while he played solitaire in his office. Not to say that he was a bad art teacher, but there were times when you could really tell that he wasn't interested in what he was actually teaching us. But moving on to the actual class on watercolor. When I was in 8th grade, he taught us the watercolor class. It was one class. And the art class and the shop were in one building at this point. In 7th grade, the art class had been in one of the other schools, actually. So it got moved that year. So when we came into class, he told us that we were going to be doing watercolor. And I was really excited because I hadn't done watercolor yet. I hadn't even used like the Crayola watercolors because, and this is going to really date me as a person, which I've been trying not to do. I don't think that the Crayola watercolors were a thing until like the mid to late 80s. And by then, I was already in like junior high. So that's a thing. So yeah. In addition to the fact that he really didn't seem interested in it, he had just moved to a new building, but still he was in the shop building a lot of the time anyways, because he got along really well with the teacher over there. But for the 8th grade class, he did have a tendency to try and stay in the classroom more. So when we got into the classroom, he gave us each a piece of watercolor paper, and then he set out on each of the tables some tempera paint. Now, I don't know if you know what tempera paint is or not, but basically tempera paint is like these hockey puck size dry paint things that you throw into like a gallon thing, and you throw water onto them and you mix them up and they become poster paint. So I guess they can be used as a watercolor paint, but we only had three colors, and they were the red, the blue, and the yellow. So that's all we had for color. And he told us after we got sat down and we had our paper, that we were to all take our paper out to the giant sink in the shop class that was stained and covered in oil and all kinds of fun stuff. We were supposed to take our paper out, get it wet out there, and that was the only water that we would be able to use for this class. There were no cups of water. There was no other type of water. And we had to be careful because those hockey pucks of paint had to be used for making poster paint for them to use on canvas in other classes later. So we all went out and stood in line. I think there was like 25 of us. We all stood out to get our papers wet. I put a little bit of water on it and I spread it out to the edges because I know how water reacts with paper. Now, I hadn't used watercolor paper before, so I didn't think there was going to be a big difference. And it was, I believe it was hot press. It did have texture to it. So I went and I got some water on it, went back into the classroom. Teacher stopped me and said that wasn't enough water and had me go back, get in line again, put more water on my paper, which I did. Came back and he was already talking about how to do whatever with this paint. And so I missed half of the conversation. He looked at my paper and sent me back a third time to put more water on it. By this time, before I even put the third dousing of water on it, my paper was already starting to buckle. I was not happy with this. So I went on ahead, went out. I just soaked it. I'll admit I went out and I soaked the heck out of that paper because apparently when it was wet enough that the paper was already starting to buckle, it wasn't enough water. So I came back and he said, "That's better." Now go sit down and start your paint. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know what I'm doing because I literally missed everything that he talked about for this. So I sat down with my friends and I put some water on my brush from my paper, which by this point is starting to crumple up into a ball, and I started painting. I started with the red, put it on there, and it just went everywhere, and I was like, oh my god, this is going to be a mess. So all I did was red on it. I didn't want to do anything else, and my teacher came along and he said, now put another color on there. And I said, but it's going to go everywhere. And he said, well, that's the point. I said, but how do you make it into an art piece? And he said, well, after you get all the colors on, then you decide what it's going to be. And I was like, what? It made no sense to me. It still makes no sense to me. So I put blue on, and it became a really pretty kind of purpley color that I could live with. And then he came along and he said, now put the other color on there. And I'm going, but I don't want the other color on there. He still made me put the other color on, and it turned into this really muddy, just poop brown color. I swear, it was awful. It was just the most horrible color in the world. My paper, by this point, looked like I had literally taken it up and just crumpled it into a ball and piled books on it and made it just this giant, like, crumpled brown mess. And then my teacher came along and he said, okay, so now what is this? And I told him flat out it was a mess. I got a very much failing grade on this picture because it wasn't a picture. It was a mess. And that one class really, really made me hate doing watercolor because, to the best of my knowledge, that's how watercolor was. That's how it worked. You soaked the entire paper and then you just added color to it all over the place. Yeah, but now that I've been watching a few of the artists on YouTube that do watercolor over the last, I don't know, year maybe, it makes me want to try watercolor again. And so this is my first real attempt at watercolor. Alright, so apparently my camera stopped and I didn't realize it, so I missed getting part of the water on there. And so basically about all you really missed on that was just the water part with the shiny, and it turned out looking really good, but I'm not really sure it hurt the video any. So yeah, at this point I would like to thank y'all for coming back to my channel again and in listening to my story time about my 8th grade art teacher and watercolor. So I hope to see you guys again in the future, and we will talk to you next time. Bye bye.